This is the end. A whirlwind of steel, a symphony of fury, the glorious death every Viking warrior prayed for, a body that ignores wounds that should have been fatal moments ago, a mind lost in a tide of pure, ecstatic rage. This is the berserker, the apex predator of the Viking Age and the final, terrifying product of a brutal system. But how did it come to this? The engineering of Europe's most feared fighter didn't start on the battlefield. It started here, in the cold, with a simple, brutal choice: live or die. This is the story of how Viking society, in a way more brutal than any modern military, forged the perfect warrior from an infant's first breath to a berserker's last stand. Imagine you're born into the harsh, unforgiving landscape of Scandinavia. Here, survival itself is a battle against the elements, and that battle begins the moment you enter the world. A newborn Viking infant wasn't just welcomed, it was judged. The father would inspect the child, and if it was deemed weak, deformed, or simply one more mouth than a family could feed, it could be exposed, left in the wilderness to die. This wasn't seen as murder in their eyes, but a grim necessity. It was the first brutal filter in a society that couldn't afford weakness. For those who were accepted, childhood was no time of protected innocence. It was a relentless training ground. There were no schools as we know them. A child's education was practical, learned by watching and doing. While kids in other cultures were told bedtime stories about gentle fairies, Viking children were raised on the epic sagas of gods and heroes. They fell asleep to tales of Thor's hammer crushing giant skulls, and of Odin preparing his hall, Valhalla, for the souls of the greatest warriors. From their earliest memories, they were taught that a life of conflict was noble, and a death in battle was the greatest honor a man could achieve. Even their games were just training in disguise. Toddlers were given miniature wooden swords and shields, learning the feel of a weapon before they could properly speak. Games like wrestling, known as glima, taught agility and the grim realities of close-quarters combat. Snowball fights in the brutal winters weren't just for fun. Kids built fortresses and learned the basics of siege tactics and throwing. Every chore was a lesson, every game a drill. Boys were expected to work on the farm, hunt and fish, building the endurance needed for a life of hard labor and war. A lazy child who stayed by the hearth was mockingly called a charcoal chewer, a term of deep shame in a culture that prized action. By the time a boy hit his early teens, he wasn't just a child. He was an apprentice warrior, his body hardened by the cold, and his mind saturated with a culture that glorified a violent end. Comments survived if you think you'd make it through Viking childhood. This training was intense. But here's what's even more disturbing about Viking society. To really understand the Viking warrior, you have to understand how they saw death. The Norse world wasn't built on a fear of the afterlife, but on achieving the right kind of afterlife. For a warrior, there was no greater prize than to be chosen by the Valkyries and carried to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. But Valhalla wasn't some peaceful paradise. It was an eternal feasting and fighting hall. The chosen dead, the Einherjar, would spend their days battling each other in glorious combat, only to be magically healed each evening to feast and drink. This wasn't an eternity of rest. It was an eternal boot camp. Odin was assembling his ultimate army for Ragnarok, the apocalyptic battle at the end of the world. This belief was the psychological engine of the Viking Age. It took our greatest fear, death, and turned it into the ultimate ambition. Why fear dying in battle when it was your one-way ticket to glory, fighting and feasting alongside the gods? This created immense social pressure. A man's worth, his very honor, was measured by his courage in battle. So the transition from boy to man wasn't marked by age, it was marked by blood. A young man had to prove himself, and that usually happened on his first raid. The voyage itself was a test of endurance, but the real test was on the battlefield. He had to earn his place in the shield wall, prove he wouldn't break, and take a life for the first time. This was the rite of passage, a brutal crucible designed to forge loyalty and snuff out fear. A boy who had survived a harsh Viking childhood, now steeped in a death-obsessed mythology, was ready to pay the price of manhood. He was ready to kill, but more importantly, he was ready to die. Because in Viking society, a peaceful death in bed from old age wasn't just a quiet end. It was a spiritual failure, a one-way ticket to the dreary, cold underworld of hell instead of the glory of Valhalla. Drop a comment. Would you want to go to Valhalla, or does hell sound better to you after hearing this? What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you see Viking raids. Once a man earned his place, his life was defined by the shield wall. This was the heart of Viking combat. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their round shields to create a nearly impenetrable barrier. It was a living, breathing fortress built on absolute trust. Your life depended entirely on the man next to you holding the line. From behind this wall of wood and steel, they would jab with spears, waiting for the enemy to falter before erupting into a savage charge with their famed axes. The shield wasn't just for defense, it was a weapon used to punch, bind, and create the opening for a fatal strike. But if you think the Viking warrior was just a glory-seeking adventurer, you're missing half the story. Raiding wasn't only a quest for honor, it was a cold, calculated business. Their longships, true masterpieces of naval engineering, let them strike coastal towns with terrifying speed and then vanish before a real defense could be organized. And they weren't just after gold. One of their most lucrative commodities was people. Vikings were prolific slave traders, capturing men, women, and children, who they called thralls during their raids. This brutal trade in human lives fueled their economy and funded more ships, with Dublin becoming the biggest slave market in Western Europe. Some estimates suggest that at the peak of the Viking Age, thralls may have made up as much as a quarter of the population in some Scandinavian areas. This reveals a chillingly pragmatic side to their violence. The Viking warrior wasn't just fighting for Valhalla, he was fighting for profit. Comment shocked if this changed how you see Viking raids. They were basically Viking LLC. But wait, there's more. The shield wall and the longship were just their standard tools. The Vikings had another weapon, a human one, far more terrifying. If the average Viking warrior was a wolf, the berserker was something else entirely. He was the culmination of a lifetime of physical hardship and psychological conditioning. The berserker, or bear shirt, was a warrior said to enter a trance-like state of uncontrollable fury known as berserkergang. Comment berserker if you want to see how they actually fought. This gets insane. The truth is, no one knows for sure how they did it. Theories point to bizarre rituals, hallucinogenic plants, or even a form of self-induced hysteria that flooded the body with adrenaline. The sagas tell us they howled like beasts, foamed at the mouth, and gnawed on the iron rims of their shields. In this state, they were described as having superhuman strength, immune to pain from fire or steel, and capable of fighting on despite mortal wounds. This wasn't just rage, it was psychological warfare. Imagine seeing a man, maybe even wearing the skin of a bear, charge your lines with no regard for his own life, screaming and seemingly unable to feel pain. It was enough to make even veteran soldiers break and run. The berserker was the ultimate expression of the Viking death cult, a warrior who had so completely conquered the fear of death that he could cast aside his own humanity to become a pure vessel of destruction. And so, we come back to the battlefield, to the warrior in his final moments. Whether he's a disciplined soldier in the shield wall or a frenzied berserker in his last charge, his end is the fulfillment of a lifelong promise. His entire existence, from that first gasp of cold air as a baby, through the violent games of childhood, to the first blood on his axe, was engineered for this single moment. He falls, a weapon still in his hand, a roar still on his lips. For him, this isn't a tragedy, it's a graduation. It's the victory his entire culture programmed him to seek above all others. This brutal, death-obsessed system is what allowed a relatively small population from the frozen north to terrorize Europe for centuries, leaving behind a legacy written in blood and fire. Final question, Valhalla or bust? Let me know below. Would you choose the glory path or the quiet life? So the Viking warrior wasn't simply born strong, he was forged piece by piece by a society that had perfected the art of turning boys into killers and killers into legends. They were a product of their harsh world, and in turn, they reshaped that world through sheer, unrelenting force. If you want to explore more raw and unfiltered truths of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past.